I think the recording has begun, Muskan.
Ma'am, it has not but started live streaming. I'm waiting for that cue. Or
Oh,
should I begin? Snigdha, can you please clarify if it has started?
It hasn't started as of now. There is some glitch, seems like that.
Okay.
this is the 21st century equivalent of waiting for the curtain to rise.
In that case, maybe I should hide. I don't want to lose the drama.
Right. This is a very interesting backdrop for you, Carl.
Yeah, that's right here in San Diego. That's about 5-minute walk from my office.
Ooh,
I've been here 11 years, and it took me 9 years to discover this was just across the street from me. I never left my office.
good Lord.
Now I go there every time I'm up in La Jolla and campus. I go down to the beach there and I watch the people paragliding, floating by. From the elevators at our office, we can watch them float by. It's a great way to end the day.
So it took
So
you 9
peaceful.
years to discover it. That's what happens when you get involved with capitalism in China, right?
Exactly. Let that be a warning to younger people. Work-life balance, people.
Okay, Snigdha, tell us, should we just start and then we can do the live streaming later?
Yeah, we can do that. I have asked Amit, but there is no, means he will require time. We may start. It is being recorded. We can put it on YouTube later on.
Exactly. That's I think that we should do that. Mm.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Mm.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Muskan Punia, and I'm a research intern at the ICS. I am honored to serve as the master of ceremony for today's event. It brings me immense joy to extend a warm welcome to each one of you who has joined us for another enriching session of the ICS special lecture titled Communism versus Capitalism in Everyday Chinese Life since 1949, the life and death of a call for interpretive framing. Capitalism and communism were seen as fierce competitors during the Cold War, fighting to the death for supremacy. Despite the Chinese Communist Party's intent to eliminate capitalism with the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Professor Gerth argues in his book, Unending Capitalism, that CCP policies actually fostered various forms of capitalism and increased consumerism. This contradicted the communist revolution's goals from the Mao era to the present. This lecture challenges conventional notions about capitalism, communism, and so-called socialist countries, highlighting how the pursuit of mass-produced consumer goods reshaped the 20th century world. The speaker for today's seminar is Professor Carl Gerth, who is a professor of history and the Shu Endowed Chair in Chinese Studies at the University of California, San Diego. The areas of his research interest include the history and contemporary implications of consumerism and capitalism, particularly in the case of China. His most recent book is Unending Capitalism, How Consumerism Negated China's Communist Revolution, which explores the contradiction between the stated socialist aspirations of the Chinese Communist Party and the growing inequalities created by industrialization. He is also the author of As China Goes, So Goes the World, China Made, Consumer Culture and the Creation of the Nation, a history of economic nationalism in early 20th century China. The chair for today's session is Dr. Hemant Adlakha, who is an associate professor at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is also vice chairperson and honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. His areas of research include political discourse in the PRC and modern Chinese literature and culture. He is a member of International Editorial Committee, International Society for Lushun Studies, Seoul. His articles have appeared in China Report, The Diplomat, Japan Times, Encyclopedia of Race and Racism. His co-translation of Lu Xun's prose poetry collection from Chinese into Hindi has been published by the NBT in 2019. His most recent publications include Trust Building Between US and China, Lessons from the Cold War, Knowing China, Sinomania to Sinophobia, a chapter in the book India-China Dialogues Beyond Borders. Before I hand over to Dr. Adlakha, I would request all participants to adhere to some housekeeping rules. During the presentation, all the participants will be muted. You may post your questions in the chat box. Alternatively, you may raise your hand during the interactive session. After the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask your questions. Please remember to mention your name and affiliation while posting your questions. Sir, I now hand over to you to take the proceedings.
Okay, thank you, Muskan. Let me also once again welcome Carl Gerth, our speaker today. At the very outset, I'm very excited with this event happening today. I'm thankful to Ms. Anelka for giving me this opportunity to chair this session, and also I'm very honored actually to be present here to listen to Professor Carl Gerth. And I was mentioning to him before we formally started this discussion that it's very rare. I mean, rare in the sense that, of course, consumerism in China has been discussed both in the mainstream discourse in the academia and the media since the reform and open door policy has been implemented in the late 70s. But to take it into its depths, political and ideological depths, and have a very profound kind of a discussion and writings, that is something which we do not come across very often, either in the academic discourse or in the media analysis of the. Therefore, I'm very excited with this event today. And once again, thank you, Professor Carl Gerth, for having agreed to come and share with us your views. Now, with that, let me also very briefly share one or two observations of mine related to this subject, and also throw a teaser, perhaps in the beginning, to Professor Carl Gerth. Teaser in the sense that, I mean, his latest or most recent book, which is called Unending Capitalism, and the topic of today's presentation, if I remember it correctly, which is the communism and capitalism in China since 1949. I was wondering, isn't it kind of a either a conflicting title with your claim that consumerism has negated the Chinese Communist Revolution? That's a teaser. But keeping it aside, let me also bring in, as I was telling you a little bit earlier, that in China, we see a completely perhaps opposite kind of discourse coming out. They don't see consumerism or market capitalism or free market capitalism as a negation of the Chinese Revolution. In fact, they see it as a very that this has equipped the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Revolution to take on the capitalism led by the US. In the sense that, as you mentioned in your brief introduction about today's talk, you said that with the establishment of the PRC in 1949, the Communist Party of China, or the CCP, if you will, aimed to end capitalism. And that's absolutely correct, fine. But I mean, no one has any issues with that, because even before China, it was Soviet Union, Lenin himself, in the 1979 October Revolution itself. Since then, from Lenin down to all the successive Soviet leaders, everyone had been having this ultimate goal of establishing the Soviet supremacy or superiority And the only way to go about this was to achieve victory over the US capitalism. And of course, as we know, the last of the leaders, Soviet leaders, Gorbachev, perhaps, as we are told now, is blamed for being, hurrying the process, and in the process leading to dissolving the Soviet Union. So that chase from Soviet Union to establish its socialist superiority over capitalism came to an end. But in China also, the same, then as if the mantle was passed on to China. And in Chinese discourse, we see that in fact it was Mao Zedong who in the mid-50s or late 50s, actually some references are given to 1958 Great Leap Forward onwards. And before that, when Mao called America the paper tiger. All these were seen as the Chinese now chasing the defeat of the US capitalism and establishing some kind of a socialist supremacy. But by Chinese, their own admittance and acknowledgement that Mao project of establishing socialist supremacy over US capitalism actually brought China also to the brink of collapse by the disastrous Cultural Revolution in the mid-70s. But then after that, with the demise of Mao and the kind of new regime which took over, and with the political ideological slogans of socialism with Chinese characteristics on the one hand, and emancipation of mind on the other hand, which are now being again told to us that they were the mechanisms to get rid of Mao Zedong kind of socialist thinking. But China started a new chase to defeat the US capitalism, because that ultimately has become the criteria for establishing the socialist supremacy, to catch up with the West and then to overtake the West, to overtake the US capitalism, US system. So this is what we see what is happening in China. And of course, it is hard to believe that in China, this kind of a discourse is getting more and more intense, actually, especially since what has been going on in the Sino-US relations since the President Donald Trump came to White House 8 years ago. And then what he started, and that then got further intensified under the President Biden. And at the same time, the discourse within China, and I'm sure with the full support and backup from the Communist Party ideologues, that some scholars in China claim that the competition or the race for supremacy between the two systems has now reached its final showdown. And they claim that China's rapid rise in the last 3-4 decades, etc., has given China a definite advantage over the so-called declining US. That's what the Chinese are claiming now. And the reason for their so-called claim is that they have a better system, which is a combination of government-led market economy over the corporate profit-hungry US kind of a capitalist system. That is the now discourse, which is at least I can quote, for example, a Chinese economist who wrote about this last year in Shanghai. And let me end by citing from Professor Chu Ying in Shanghai, who said, and I quote, "The Soviet Union and China have both previously tried and failed to overtake the US in various aspects. However, China's rise in the past few decades and the new Cold War has given China a renewed impetus to challenge the US for supremacy." So I will end here and invite Professor Karl Gerth to take this further. Please, the floor is yours, Professor.
Can I just jump in just for one very brief minute and say, give a very warm welcome to the participants who have joined us. Carl, on a Saturday, we have 45 people coming to hear you, and I'm very happy that the students are more, interested in the vital issues that you're going to be talking about. So it's a testament to both your reputation, your scholarship, and the interest of our students to listen to a topic such as this. So welcome to all our participants and all.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I've never had a talk before where I got so many provocative comments before I've said anything. So that's great. I hope we have a very lively discussion at the end of my presentation. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and of course the invitation, as well as the staff of the Institute for the preparations. And of course, thank you all again for listening in today. I'm grateful to be back at the Institute after 20 years. 20 years ago, I was there in person. Next time, I hope to be in person again. Let me just start my stopwatch here. I'll do 3 things with my 35 minutes. Let me get my share screen going here. Oops, portion of screen. Huh. Oh, that's odd. Okay. Everyone can see the screen then?
Yes.
Great. Let's see if I can move this a little bit over here so I can still see my notes. Okay, I'd like to do 3 things with my 35 minutes of time today. First, I will explore the ways we use those terms, socialism and capitalism, to create what I'm calling the standard interpretive framing of the world since the end of World War II. I hope to convince you of the benefits of considering an alternative framing. Second, I'll challenge the standard interpretive framing, not with traditional subjects such as political elites from above or workers and production from below. Rather, I'll discuss the history of consumerism. I'll suggest that the continuous expansion of consumerism since the Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949 reveals the shortcomings of this standard interpretive framing. Last, I'll provide 5 reasons I believe an alternative framework would be helpful. Above all, I want to show the benefits of retiring the standard interpretive framing. That interpretation views anything and everything that happened in China in the first 4 decades after 1949 as part of building socialism. Instead, I'd like to suggest the advantages of interpreting the PRC's history since 1949 and right down to the present as shifting varieties of capitalism. In my view, the standard interpretive framing of a socialist China, a framing still alive 75 plus years later, is less persuasive a way to understand the world's recent past and comprehend its present. So let me go on to that first part, these contending interpretations. Let's begin with what I am calling the standard interpretive framing of a socialist China. We usually think of the history of China since the Communist Revolution in 1949 as what? As an attempt by Chairman Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, to, in their words, build socialism, 建设社会主义. The People's Republic of China, or PRC, under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, was building socialism on its way to communism. In this framing, that distinction between socialism and communism is critical. Socialism and communism are often used interchangeably by academics, but the Chinese Communist Party has always maintained, even today, socialism is the transitional stage on the way to the end goal of communism. As we'll see, labeling socialism as a transitional stage allows the CCP and its supporters to explain away everything and anything the Communist Party does as part of the messy journey from capitalism through socialism to the ultimate destination of communism. Well, a lot, as I hope to show you today, needs to be explained away. As part of the socialist road to communism, the Communist Party even justifies China's growing inequality, capitalists as members of the Communist Party, and growing number of billionaires in China that we see today. As we assess the worthiness of the standard interpretive framework, let's be clear, when we call everything and anything part of socialist China, we are adhering to a state-sponsored interpretive framing of history. It's hard for me to think of another historical example where scholars so readily, so eagerly follow the state's own interpretation of state actions and outcomes. By way of analogy, imagine the absurdity of calling anything and everything done under the Trump administration in the United States as part of a grand effort to make America great again. Some people defend the history of the PRC as a noble experiment in human liberation. Others criticize the Communist Party's attempts to build socialism as a giant failure. And the failure of the Chinese Communist Party provides a justification for not trying to find an alternative to capitalism in our present. At the core of all of these variations, whether you hate what they did or love what they did, the idea is the same, that the Communist Party was doing something profoundly different compared to the industrial capitalist world. Of course, some scholars acknowledge the drawback of following a state-sponsored framing of history. There are certainly variations within the standard framing of a Communist Party that was building socialism. Sometimes scholars acknowledge that socialist China isn't a perfect characterization. Some add qualifications to their framing, such as state socialism or actually existing socialism. Or they invent new terms like describing latecomers to industrial capitalism as developmental states. But more often, scholars, especially historians, don't use any qualifications at all. Both the Communist Party and its enemies abroad, including in places such as the United States, subscribe to this standard interpretive framework. China was building socialism on its way to communism. Likewise, secondary sources speak of a socialist China or even a communist China without any discussion of what they mean by these terms. Countless documentaries, research monographs, and textbooks reinforce this standard interpretive framework. It seems taken for granted that whatever the Communist Party was up to was exactly what the party itself claimed, namely, everything and anything was part of the grand effort to build socialism on its way to communism. Well, in contrast, I propose we frame the history of China since 1949 through its development of state-dominated varieties of capitalism. Let me show you what I mean by that. Since 1949, the Chinese Communist Party, which has been under constant threat of invasion, made frantic, desperate adjustments to the country's institutional arrangements to expand capitalism. So more use of markets in this interpretation, more use of markets or less use of markets, more use of state planning or less use of state planning, or more or less private ownership of capital do not define China as more or less capitalist. In my view, these are just institutional arrangements periodically adjusted throughout China's history to expand capitalism. For instance, in 1961, we begin to see a shift back towards greater private control over capital, including land, and greater use of markets, and a step back from state planning. These shifts in capitalism are also visible in my specific area of research interest, the state involvement in decisions over what people consumed. Sometimes, such as the late 1950s, the state attempted to exercise greater control over consumption. But in the early 1960s, state policies shifted. The state relaxed its control and allowed markets and private capital greater influence. In my view, the changes to the institutional arrangements between the Great Leap Forward towards communism in 1959 and the policy reversals of the early 1960s are not evidence first of steps towards and then back away from socialism. Rather, 1959 and 1961, as well as every other year, represent more or less direct state control over capital accumulation. The underlying priority in all these policies remains the same: rapid industrialization, capital accumulation, and not the socialist emphasis on human flourishing. So, to capture more of the history of China, including policies that would otherwise seem anomalous and contradictory, I interpret all forms of industrial capitalism in China and elsewhere as moving points on a spectrum of state to private control over industrial capitalism, from, at one extreme, a capitalism with complete state domination, to, at the other extreme, a completely market-mediated capitalism. Of course, neither of these archetypes actually existed in history. Let me shift then to part two, my evidence, and the reason why I offer up this alternative explanation. The title of my book here on this slide makes my argument explicit. Unending Capitalism. The Communist Revolution explicitly aimed to end capitalism, but the Communist Party policies actually expanded it. Communist Party policies continually destroyed, or to use the party's own term, negated the goals of its communist revolution. Please note, as you can see on that illustration, that you can download free copies of the PDF of this book in English or Chinese via my page on academia.edu. Or if that fails for some reason, you can always email me. In my book, I do not make my case by arguing about concepts. In other words, I do not argue that my own preferred use of a concept such as capitalism is the truer reading of Marx or the correct definition of capitalism. Rather, I argue for a different framing by foregrounding a previously marginalized topic, the history and spread of consumerism since 1949. Then I examine the implications for how we frame the history of China and indeed all self-described socialist countries. So again, first I look for the evidence that consumerism was alive and well and spreading throughout this period, and then I ask us to wonder, what are the implications of all of this? I recognize that it is customary to discuss industrial capitalism through production and not what I see as the demand side of capitalism. But in my view, the organization of production and consumption are two sides of the same industrial coin. The consumerist turn in scholarship during the past 30+ years has shown students of capitalism that industrial production has always required a simultaneous industrial consumption, what we might call industrial consumerism. So rather than only or even primarily defining China through its relations of production, I focus on relations of consumption, the distribution of the surplus, or simply who got what. When I say the spread of consumerism, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with exactly what I mean. So I mean three things here. First, I mean the mass production of consumer products such as bicycles and bicycle brands pictured here. Here we have, in this illustration or the slide, we have a whole bunch of bicycles, and this illustration on the right shows you the proliferation of bicycle brands in China from after 1949. Second, when I speak of the spread of consumerism, I also mean the spread of discourses about products and popular media. Long before people could own mass-produced things, they often started to encounter these things around them, either in person or in advertising and movies. So movies of the late 1950s helped stimulate demand filled only in the early 1960s or later. Seeing these products all around them taught people to associate consumer products with meanings such as those embodied in these illustrations. To take these two, on the left there, that this or that brand of toothpaste would give you a better smile. And indeed, that you needed to worry about the whiteness of your teeth. Or in this screen grab from the 1964 film, Never Forget Class Struggle, that having a leather jacket made you fashionable. Third, when I speak of the spread of consumerism, I mean that people start, it's not like 500 million people all did this at the same time, people start to create and communicate hierarchical identities through the consumption of these mass-produced, branded things. Identities such as that people with wristwatches were more sophisticated than their rural peers, as these women sent from Shanghai to the countryside perhaps thought. The continual expansion of consumerism ensured the continual growth of industrial capitalism. And as with every other industrializing country, when China began to fulfill the first mass-produced set of desires, new ones came along, as this slide suggests. One set of desires begets desires for greater capital-intensive things. Here, the must-have items of the Mao era of the 1950s, pictured in the upper left corner, this says 50s, are a wristwatch, bicycle, and a sewing machine. This becomes, in the 1980s, what you see here, a TV, a washing machine, and a boombox, and a stereo or computer in the 1990s, and the 21st century, a condo and a car. Industrial consumerism made mass-produced products increasingly indispensable for tens of millions of people. I found countless anecdotes of people wanting and obtaining luxury products in archives, newspapers, through interviews, as well as on internet blogs. Let me provide you with just a few of the countless ways people used wristwatches beyond simply telling what time it is. I found examples of people using wristwatches in the Mao era in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as bribes to officials, as ways for farmers to store value after a good harvest, and even as rewards for parents to give their children in order to entice them to study harder for school entrance exams. In many cases, literal social reproduction, that is the ability to find a wife and have children, depended on the groom's family to obtain one or more of these most sought-after items, a wristwatch, bicycle, and a sewing machine. As China industrialized, of course the country made more and more consumer goods, but with what implications? I think that who gets what, that is, how society distributes what it creates, the surplus, suggests how we might characterize a society. In simpler terms, who got the first wristwatches, bicycles, and sewing machines, and then the next after that, after that, after that, and so on, and what are the implications of that order of distribution? I concluded that the Chinese Communist Party was not building the egalitarian, democratic socialism of its loudly stated socialist claims. Rather, the Communist Party was building the exact inequalities that Marx himself associated with industrial capitalism everywhere. Inequalities that include these here: urban, privileged over rural workers, factory over farm work, mental over manual labor, men over women, Han majorities over minority peoples, and other forms of inequalities. This unequal, undemocratic distribution extended the inequalities of industrial capitalism. And it's worth remembering that the initial inequalities led to others. The first families to have sewing machines, for instance, had a labor multiplier that allowed them to continually increase their advantages. These inequalities were the direct result of state policies and priorities. The state aimed to control all three aspects of consumerism that I have named: what was mass produced, the discourses about those goods, and the hierarchical identities that people began to create through the consumption of these mass-produced branded goods. Overall, state control was so extensive that I coined the term state consumerism as a correlate to China's state-led production. Production and consumption were connected. State efforts to manage demand, manage consumerism that is, freed up more resources for the production side of capitalism. That's easy to imagine, right? If you suppress consumption, that allows the state to control what is produced and funnel it all back into rapid industrialization. The efforts to suppress the demand side were so important to the Communist Party that it often equated extracting endless unpaid labor and the suppression of demand as socialism itself. The party did so, for instance, with what I consider to be the ethos and the slogan of the Mao era: "Jianku pu su," work hard and live frugally. In other words, you should give the state your labor and ask for as little as possible in return. Note that state consumerism could also promote consumption. At times such as the early 1960s, the Communist Party also shifted those institutional arrangements that I spoke of earlier to ensure the ongoing expansion of industrial capitalism. The party needed a quick fix to the economic problems caused by the Great Leap Forward of the late 1950s, for instance. So in 1961, the party sacrificed the self-described socialist goals of both stable prices and more egalitarian distribution. Distribution policies for highly sought-after consumer goods, such as those three I mentioned, wristwatches, bicycles, and sewing machines, shifted from a system based on rations and queues, which better hide inequalities, toward a system based on prices. Stores now sold products such as bicycles and wristwatches without ration coupons to anyone who had the money to buy them. How might we frame these events? I suggest that rather than seeing 1961 as a step back from China's efforts to build socialism, these policy reversals are neither contradictory nor particularly puzzling or surprising or even exceptional when we frame such policies as part of the state's unending prioritization of accumulation. To test the value of my interpretive framework, I have drawn examples from very different aspects of China's history, including the events we most closely associate with revolutionary China of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. For example, the Cultural Revolution of the late 1960s might at first seem to challenge my interpretive framing. The party and many participants intended the Cultural Revolution to be a major push against capitalism and consumerism. But I examined the signature activities of the Cultural Revolution, including the Mao badge fad, collecting of billions of badges pictured there in those first two illustrations, the Da Tuanlian, the great exchange of revolutionary experiences that allowed students to travel all over China for free to visit revolutionary sites, and even the home ransackings of Red Guards. In all of these signature activities of the Cultural Revolution, what was supposed to be the great pushback of consumerism and the emergence of capitalism, I found these events did the opposite of their intended goal. These Cultural Revolution activities helped expand consumerism. I also concluded that we can find in China many of the things we associate with consumerism in market capitalist countries. For instance, we can find efforts to justify advertising, which the state regulated but never eliminated. And there was a state-sponsored promotion of fashion trends, including the Soviet-inspired trend of the late 1950s, seen here in these dress styles. State media promoted this fashion, including in magazines such as this one on the left here, which was stamped with the name of a remote town school library, suggesting just how far state consumerism reached into the Chinese countryside. And the Chinese Communist Party expanded consumerism through what the party called socialist commerce. In fact, in my view, the party developed the infrastructure of consumerism in ways private capital in China may have otherwise not been able to attempt for decades. Consider that Walmart or Carrefour or any other chain, national chain or international chain that you've heard of, consider any of those cases. It takes a tremendous amount of capital to set up national and international chains of stores. Long before private capital in the form of chain stores such as Walmart and Carrefour arrived in China, Communist Party policies helped create a network of bookstores and department stores in every province, county, and town. Here are the illustrations of the two biggest and most famous department stores, which became something of meccas in China during this time. Highly desirable destinations. Unlike this slide, the vast majority of those tens of thousands of public stores carried only a few items. But with these stores, the Communist Party had begun to set up the economies of scale for mass production, distribution, and consumption. Party efforts to create what it called socialist commerce created unintended, but in my interpretation, entirely predictable consequences. For starters, consider the long lines that we so often associate with planned economies. The problems that shoppers encountered at stores became the sole responsibility and fault of the state, creating not simply an economic problem of how to get rid of those lines by supplying more goods, but also a political problem. Such basic problems like long lines and product shortages reflected badly on the party's claims for the superiority of its socialism. Above all, the party prioritized this rapid industrialization over meeting demand for everyday necessities. This priority helps explain its failure in the service sector. For instance, during the Great Leap Forward of the late 1950s, the state intentionally moved millions of men from the service sector to manufacturing. And they replaced those men with inexperienced women, elderly, and the handicapped. These inexperienced clerks then had to deal with shortages of products to sell, irate customers, extended work hours, and campaigns to browbeat service workers into providing better service, such as the campaign pictured in the illustration here. These clerks also had to deal with the widespread attitude that service work was demeaning. At the same time, customers faced queues, shortages, and unhelpful, inexperienced clerks. Customers and clerks alike openly wondered, what sort of socialism was this? I have no doubt that party theoreticians then or now could justify any and all contradictions under the party's vague catch-all of building socialist China. After all, explaining away the contradictions of including things such as billionaires and capitalists in your party is their job, is the job of these party theoreticians. But I don't think scholars have to follow the party's state-sponsored interpretive framework for the history of the People's Republic of China since 1949. So finally, then, I want to raise some questions that we can discuss, and along with any other questions that you have. So what? Why should we care about this? Why is this replacing of one interpretive framework with the one that I'm suggesting worthwhile? What is the promise of that? I want to suggest there are 5 reasons why we might want to replace the standard interpretation of a Chinese Communist Party that was building socialism with this shifting varieties of capitalism approach. First, I suggest why not? The Cold War is over, or until we thought recently it was over. It seems worthwhile in any case to periodically reconsider our basic concepts, starting with the concept of capitalism. Second, in my experience, framing China around the concept of ever-shifting varieties of industrial capitalism fits the historical pieces together in a way that explains away previously contradictory evidence, or frankly, evidence that was just ignored, like the rich history of consumerism in this period. This isn't where I started. At first, I followed the practice in Chinese studies by trying to interpret everything and anything that occurred in China after 1949 as part of those grand efforts to build socialism. I even considered labeling what I saw as socialist consumerism before I decided that was actually an oxymoron. But as so many things didn't fit into the standard interpretation of a socialist China, I decided I needed to go in a different direction. And after I decided on a varieties of capitalism interpretation, after I decided that it made better sense of my material, everything began to fit together much more easily. So I chose to embrace and try to explain rather than ignore or accept the Chinese Communist Party's endorsed interpretations of history. I also felt reassured about using a capitalist framing after finding so many primary and secondary sources from that time, both inside and outside of China, that led to similar conclusions that I've come to. As a reminder, there is a 100+ year history of interpreting the Soviet Union and every other self-proclaimed socialist country as actually being forms of capitalism. People inside and outside of China, both then and now, have always contested this socialist China interpretation. The 100-year history of criticism of countries claiming to be socialist provides a very different, and for my material, much more persuasive way to piece together the history. I prefer a history of China since 1949 that includes a wider range of people and evidence, and inconvenient parts of that history for the socialist interpretation, such as the policies of 1961 that I spoke of earlier, and the expanding inequalities, make more sense when we see Chinese state policies as repeatedly shifting back and forth along that spectrum of state to private varieties of capitalism and consumerism. Those shifts, of course, did not end with the death of Mao in 1976. So my approach also helps address a major historiographical and political question. What happened in the years after Mao died in 1976? Did the Chinese Communist Party abandon socialism when its theoreticians touted, quote, market socialism and socialism with Chinese characteristics? Should we still interpret China as building socialism? After all, the Communist Party still claims it's building socialism, though their time frame has shifted from the endpoint of communism being just a few months away, as it thought in 1959 during the Great Leap Forward, to nowadays, centuries away. I think it makes more sense not to see China as abandoning the communist revolution only in the 1980s when Deng Xiaoping supported the expanded use of markets for products and labor. Rather, Deng and his successors simply shifted the institutional arrangements to once again facilitate the unending expansion of capitalism. That is, Deng made bigger and longer lasting shifts than those attempted in the early 1960s. And of course, Xi Jinping has shifted China's political economy once again back towards greater state control. Scholars usually express skepticism at Deng Xiaoping's 1982 framing of state policies, still in use today, of socialism with Chinese characteristics. We usually see that phrase as a thinly veiled justification for what is really privatization with Chinese characteristics. Well, I think we should apply similar skepticism to earlier attempts by the Communist Party to call anything and everything it was doing building socialism. Third of my 5 reasons for shifting this framing is that I also want to question the socialist China interpretation, because the old communism versus capitalism binary framework focuses on what states and political elites on both sides of the Cold War wanted people to think. Leaders on both sides wanted us to frame history around capitalism versus communism. But when we look closer, we find people inside and outside of China always had doubts over what the Communist Party was in fact building. I found people at all levels of Chinese society who picked up on the contradiction between the socialist words of egalitarianism and democratic control over the surplus, over what Chinese society created, and the capitalist policies that they saw all around them, leading to ever greater inequalities. So the sources led me to my interpretation. Sure, we can debate the meaning of concepts such as capitalism and socialism in our present, but I also wanted to know what people thought at that time. Scholars using the socialist China interpretation often assume that people thought whatever the Communist Party was up to was socialism, that socialism was their lived experience, to use a trendy expression. And of course, state sources written by those party theoreticians insist on this. To be sure, some of the beneficiaries of state policies likely thought they were living in a socialist China, such as those who got the first wristwatches or those who worked as the labor aristocracy in the best places of work, the state-owned rather than the communally owned factories. And given the party control over mass media and education, undoubtedly, countless other millions must have thought this is what building socialism looks like. But I encountered pervasive doubts, and these doubts led me to question the standard interpretive framework. Uncovering such doubts helps counter the assumption of the standard interpretation that Chinese people on the street, no matter what the political economy around them suggested, thought they were building socialism. Sometimes the actions of people conveyed such doubts. Workers who went on strikes in state factories, or workers who conserved their labor power when they were at their state job, only to later sell their labor power later in private factories. And we find the usual weapons of the highly exploited rural weak: hiding, eating, and stealing grain. All of these actions express doubts. Other times, those doubts were explicit, such as when Chairman Mao Zedong himself told the famous American journalist Edgar Snow in 1965 that the children are, quote, negating the communist revolution and restoring capitalism. So again, this interpretation isn't just me out here making up concepts. It's looking back at the time and looking for doubts rather than looking for confirmation that everyone everywhere bought what the party was selling, despite the fact that there was a contradiction between what the party was saying, we're building an egalitarian, democratically controlled country, and what they were actually seeing around them. So I do not think scholars who use the socialist China interpretation are simply uncovering and honoring the lived realities of ordinary people who thought this is what socialism looks like. My concern is that we may be squeezing the experiences of the Mao era after 1949 into an interpretive box, a box originally constructed by states and the powerful. Fourth, then, expanding our understanding of industrial capitalism to include state-led varieties contributes to newer understandings of capitalism. Here's how. Regardless of the specific year, very little in China anytime in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s looked like anything what we might associate with capitalism or consumerism. But it's important to remember that capitalism always varies, yet one aspect remains constant. Capitalism always requires fresh, free inputs from outside what is traditionally thought of as capitalism. It requires the externalities of an environment to raid, unpaid care work done inside of homes, mostly by women and girls, enslaved peoples, and of course, new territories around the world to use. These free inputs, supposedly outside of capitalism, have always been necessary to produce a more orthodox variety of capitalism in the metropole. Global capitalism forced, and frankly continues to force, China to prioritize growth over everything else. The compulsory competition of global capitalism forces China to sacrifice any aspirations of building a democratic workers' socialist paradise. These global pressures help create the state-led and non-market features we see in all latecomers to industrial capitalism. Ignoring the non-market parts of capitalism ignores what allows capitalism to continually expand. Broadening our understanding of capitalism to include the non-market features, for instance, allows us to discern these free input aspects that I've mentioned. I try to broaden capitalism to include its other half then, the demand and consumption side. From this perspective, we can much more readily see the unfolding of the inequalities of industrial capitalism. Fifth and finally, the climate crisis. We know that the continual compulsory expansion of capitalism, or what's sometimes known as a way of avoiding the C word, as growthism, is killing our biosphere. Good history already includes the analytical categories of race, gender, class, and ethnicity, but contemporary history must now include the climate crisis and its existential threat to humanity. To understand the challenges of addressing the climate crisis, we need to understand capitalism and its global prioritization of growth, even over human survival. And I don't think it helps us to understand the world, to exoticize what was an inter-capitalist rivalry by framing China since 1949 as a grand but failed attempt to replace capitalism with socialism. Rather, I think we learn more about capitalism by focusing on the growth and consumption imperatives embedded in the consumerism at the heart of all forms of industrial capitalism, then and now. Thank you for your time and interest, and I look forward to your questions and our discussion.
Thank you, Professor Carl Gerth. That was really, in a very short time, you really presented before us a very kind of full sweep of the contradictions of the ideological as well as the existential competitiveness between the two rival ideologies on the one hand. And at the same time, you also brought it out very convincingly that what China was pursuing since 1949 was perhaps different kinds of capitalisms within the so-called Chinese socialism or Chinese brand of socialism. And ultimately, after the death of Mao, when the new Deng Xiaoping reforms were introduced, as you mentioned, that they were far more intensive and extensive at the same time from what was experimented after the failure of the Great Leap Forward in the 60s. So thank you so much once again for this wonderful presentation. And I'm sure we have lots of questions waiting for you to answer. So let us go now, Muskan, to the chat box and see if there are any questions there. I don't see, at least in the first part of the screen, any raised hands so far. If there are any, please, okay, we have, shall we take the raised hand questions first?
Yes, sir. There is no question in the chat box as of now.
Okay, so we have a raised hand from Cherry Hitkari. So please spell out your question, Cherry.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Gerth, for such a fascinating presentation. My question is about the notions of beauty, self-adornment, and consumerism among women. I thoroughly enjoyed your book, Unending Capitalism, particularly how you highlight that Mao's China was no different from other societies where women became not just the target audience for certain advertising campaigns, but also how women's bodies were, I would say, strategically utilized to sell both commercial products and the idea of the revolution. And I would like to bring up the Kanlu skincare advertisement that you discuss at length in the book. Concurrently, we see quite a heavy ideological and moral policing on women when it comes to self-adornment. So given these complexities, how did women respond to such gendered notions of consumerism, specifically across the rural-urban divide? Thank you.
Wow, that's an awesome question. And first of all, thank you for reading the entire book. I originally had a 40,000 word introduction and decided that rather than arguing with people over terms, I'd rather they just read the evidence and decide for themselves. Do they really want to look through all of this, see these unfolding inequalities, and continue to insist on the same interpretive framework? So I really am, but people do anyway without actually reading my evidence. They get very upset at challenging these established frameworks. So it's really great to talk to someone who's read the book and read the specific chapters. Unfortunately, I don't have a specific chapter for you. I have a specific invitation or request. I don't see myself as having the last word on any of the topics that I talk about. Rather, I hope I'm opening avenues for people who explore advertising. So advertising is just one teeny part of one chapter. So I had very little time to talk about the issue that you raised, how women actually felt about what was going on with them. Of course, I would imagine some of them were more than happy, as those women showing their wristwatches were happy to create a hierarchical identity and to differentiate themselves from it by the peers. And as you mentioned, I talk about it in various places where one woman, a famous movie star, famous voiceover star, wanted to become a cadre, a member of the Communist Party, and an official, so that she could wear the outfit that was fashionable right after the Communist Revolution. So I have no doubt that we would find plenty of people who immediately bought into the communication of hierarchical identities through the consumption of things. But as as I think your question is sort of suggesting, I suspect there were plenty of other people who saw this going on and said, "What the heck is this? What does this have to do with creating an egalitarian society?" But I don't have the evidence because I didn't spend much time looking for that, because as you saw, I had very little time for this. The book was 120,000 words, and the way that I tried to make my case was to keep picking all of these different kind of examples and say, even if you take what others would take to be the best evidence for the attempt to create an anti-capitalist socialist alternative, I can turn that on the head. So I only have the first word, I'm afraid, in these topics. Perhaps you'll have the last word on that topic. I see one question I can read in the chat. Yes, so I appreciate that question about the Cultural Revolution in particular, because it perfectly segues from what I was just talking about. And what I was just talking about was, in order to test my interpretation, I had to go after what I considered to be the best cases against my interpretation. So in the Cultural Revolution, we see as this last-ditch effort to push back what Mao sees going on in the Soviet Union. A few years before the Cultural Revolution, Mao says that the Soviet Union is restoring capitalism. And in his critique, the ninth polemic on the Soviet Union's Communist Party, he specifies many things of what a restoration of capitalism would look like. Guess what? All of those things that he points to in the Soviet Union were concurrently going on in China itself. So along comes the Cultural Revolution a few years after the release of that polemic in 1966. And Mao, this is seen as this great effort to destroy the four olds, to establish a new socialist culture, to do all these things culturally to try to push back the advent of a similar unfolding to what Mao sees happening in the Soviet Union. So those examples that I mentioned very briefly, the proliferation of billions and billions of red badges. In the chapter on the badge fad, yes, I call it a consumer fad, we see exactly what we would what I've talked about in all of these all these other aspects. We see the distribution of the most fashionable badges distributed entirely along the axes that I talked about earlier. Urban over rural, mental over manual, so a cadre would have better access than somebody working in the countryside in the fields. Factory workers over farm workers, Han over minority peoples, and so on. All those inequalities we could see mapped onto how badges were distributed, consumed, and displayed. This was so obvious, again, because some might think, oh, this is just my very cynical American consumerist projection onto China. Zhou Enlai himself said the badge fad had gotten completely out of hand, and that whereas people in Beijing would have hundreds of badges, you'd go 20 miles outside of Beijing into the countryside, into the impoverished countryside, and people wouldn't have a single one. So that is maybe the most famous example from that period, but also take house ransackings. This is when the Cultural Revolution would go to supposedly bourgeois households, famously that included academics like many of us assembled here, rifle through their possessions and confiscate anything deemed bourgeois. Well, what I try to show in that chapter is people knew these things were coming, and if they didn't, they quickly tried to do everything they could to distribute, to sell and use markets, all of those kind of possessions. And if they didn't sell those possessions in time, those possessions were then encountered by Red Guards and put on display. So they unearthed stuff that was hidden in the homes of wealthy people, and they helped redistribute those things through Chinese society so that they could again play those roles of creating those hierarchies of consumption. Let's see, what was the last example that I used? The last example I used was the Dachuanlian, the Great Exchange of Revolutionary Experiences. I talk about how these students, guess where they want to go? Okay, sure, they go off to very impoverished parts of China, but many of these students want to go to Shanghai and Beijing, and when they go there, the records show they want to go to those two department stores that I put on display there. They want to see these artifacts that maybe they had seen only in films. So again, what I'm trying to suggest that in all of those cases, the activity is designed to suppress or end or push back against the advent of consumerism and all the inequalities associated with this actually backfired and did the opposite of their intended goal. I see another raised hand.
Okay. Is there any other raised hand?
I saw a raised hand by Alka Acharya. Oops, that goes. Sorry, I was just going to get for reading. I hope I didn't butcher your name. Please.
Yeah, so should I go ahead? All right.
Yes, please.
So completely endorse the general feeling that this has been really quite a treat. I have two kind of foundational questions, not so much of detail as Jerry was asking, or Shah's point about cultural revolution and the consumerist problem. My foundational questions relate, one, to the fact that since you do not have any kind of a blueprint for constructing a socialist society, Marx never provided one. By default, it is the Soviet Union that sets the template, which is essentially a centralized state control over all forces of production, and then try and devise or organize your relations according to that control. And obviously, the degree to which decentralization takes place in the Soviet Union and in China differs. Their entire rural strategy differs. So that's one thing, that it's really something that is being done. It's literally like crossing the river by feeling the stones. You're building socialism as you move along. And therefore, problems like what you start to examine come in. So the question, therefore, is that, is there an inevitability? In other words, if you take the consumerist end as you have it, and I think that's a really fascinating way to examine the whole scenario, then we are looking at a fairly reductionist kind of an argument that consumerism will step by step lead you to capitalism. And therefore, there is really no way out. You cannot do without. So, do you distinguish between distribution of consumer goods and consumerism? Because obviously, you cannot do away with the former. When does the net, and you did go into this whole point about how the service sector was brought into distributing what was essential. I mean, it was still an economy of shortages. So you do then, therefore, try to balance between distribution of consumer goods, but that is again mired in all sorts of problems, and the consumerism that starts to emerge. When does consumerism, therefore, become a part of the socialist construction strategy? I mean, where does it have any kind of is there any recognition within the party elites or within the decision-making structures that because Mao did raise this issue over and over again and yet was unable to, and you could argue that even he at the last minute stepped back from the kind of chaos that was obviously, and brought in the army. So my point really here is that, is this therefore no way out of eventually going and joining this big sea of capitalism? All roads lead to capitalism.
Yeah. Well, I'm not even sure where to start in answering many questions that you raised in there. But let me start by mentioning something that kind of I slipped in the language in there, but I think that is very important to foreground. That the word compulsory. I think that China is going to fend off the Soviet Union and or the United States at the same time. It has to prioritize industrialization at all costs if it wants to remain a nation state. If it wants to become a sort of anarchist paradise where there's just, you break down the nation state and you just have communally organized peoples around the country, perhaps that's an alternative. But if you want to remain a nation state and fend off the invasions, the incursions of the United States and the Soviet Union, you have to prioritize industrialization at all costs. That has a knock-on effect all the way down to the levels of consumption, all the way down to that making your way across the river by stepping. How? It makes a way across, it manifests in that every time you see the Chinese Communist Party, then or now, having to choose between the objectives that they state they have of creating a more egalitarian society versus the needs to accumulate as quickly as possible when you're coming as a latecomer to industrial capitalism, when you're already behind all of those other countries, then that's going to win. And if that wins, and in my interpretation, if that's always your priority, everywhere you look at all of these experiments, then you don't have socialism. You have the prioritization. I mean, the capitalism for me and them is by definition the prioritization of the needs of capital over the needs of human flourishing. And the needs of capital, in this case, to fend off the foreign imperialist aggressors, is so great that it subordinates everything else. And when I looked at case after case of this sort of instance, always I found that the needs of capital won. So for instance, an example that I like to point out in the Great Leap Forward is there's two famous experiments in the Great Leap Forward where women are supposedly liberated from the double burden by what? By having childcare provided for them and public dining so that they could, as I mentioned earlier, replace those millions of men who are now pushed into production rather than into the service sector. Well, guess what? Very quickly on, within months, those dining options and the public provisioning of childcare disappeared, leaving women to bear the burden of those double burden of continuing to do all that childcare, all that social reproduction on the one hand, and now having jobs on top of it. For me, what explains that is not that China gave up on socialism. I can believe that they meant what they said, that they wanted to create an anti-capitalist alternative in socialism. But when I put it in the larger context of the world and put it in China's larger context of wanting to survive as a nation, I see that they are forced to prioritize the needs of accumulation over the needs of building an egalitarian democratic control over the surplus. So that was only one part. You had mentioned earlier about consumerism and how that fits into the party's agenda. And I kind of, as I mentioned, I coined that term state consumerism. State consumerism at first sounds like state's going to only suppress. But as I sort of mentioned, even in the 1950s, when China was incredibly poor, there were moments like that effort to promote Soviet-style dresses that I showed the illustrations before, where the state uses its power over the discourses surrounding consumption to say, let's all wear this. That's what it means to be patriotic. And of course, in my interpretation, in the late 1970s and early 80s, China had successfully industrialized up to a point, and it needed to try to get people to want more and more stuff. So instead of suppressing all and any consumption and redirecting that into endless expansion of production, China needed to get people to want more and more stuff by the late 1970s. They were producing more bicycles, wristwatches, and sewing machines. So they began to then shift those institutional arrangements from suppressing all and any consumption to starting to promote it, to get rich is glorious and all of that. So those are two of the different things sparked by your provocative comments. I'm not sure if you want to have a follow-up to that or a challenge of that, or get me to elaborate on any of that.
Well, I'll let other questions come in, and then maybe I'll come in at the end because I do have a follow-up here, but maybe let's get others in.
Okay, Anand, Anand, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm there, but I think there's a question in the chat box. Maybe that can be taken, or should I go?
Yeah, you please ask your question and then we will go to chat box.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gerth. I think it was quite fascinating to hear your alternative interpretations of capitalism. But I had a couple of questions, but I think it also takes me back to a couple of years before when there was this essay by sociologist Eli Friedman, when he says in the Spectre Journal, where he says that why is China capitalist? So he has already made the thing that this is nothing but capitalism which exists in China. But in that essay of his, he is making this main argument of capitalism from the point of view of commodification. And a lot of work has very well happened on how everything in China, from whether it is land, whether it is labor, or now even in terms of other things getting increasingly commodified. Which also takes me to this question of when you're talking about capitalism, because this was not explicitly mentioned or did not find a lot of references in your presentation, what happens to class? I mean, the question of class itself, how do you now challenge? Because that also is an important marker when you are putting both these things as binaries of socialism versus capitalism. So what does class do, or is class also getting conditioned by consumerism? Uh, because there could be many things. I mean, of course, you are talking about rise of billionaires, and their consumer tastes are quite different from, say, a present day worker. So, do you equate both kinds of consumerism as part of this consumer project, or of state consumerism in also as you define? So, what does that so? So the question is about
Okay,
class.
yep. Well, I've got both questions are terrific.
No, no, no. I know.
So
that was only one question. The second simple question is, of course, this is more to do with recency, with this entire notion of common prosperity, what Xi Jinping is raising. And he is talking about, of course, he's not mentioning it in terms of class, but he does talk about redistribution of wealth, more regulation. And this has all the paraphernalia of some kind of state intervention. So how does then common prosperity fit into this matrix also? So yeah, those were the questions.
Well, yeah, that's great. First of all, your comments allowed me to make a qualification or elaborate on something that I only touched on very briefly in my presentation. Namely, outside of the places that we look for capitalism, namely the market capitalist countries of Western Europe, America, Japan, and so on, the rest of the world is going to look quite different. They're going to be shaped and misshapen by their relationship with the metropole, with these capitalist countries. So commodification, labor markets are going to look very different in these places. Now, one way to think about it is, I was once said, someone once asked me, gee, Carl, in your interpretation, I suppose work points that workers were given is a proto form of commodification of labor. And I said, well, now that you mention it, yes, that a lot of the things that China was doing to desperately catch up and fend off the imperialist powers were motivated by what was going on in the capitalist metropole. So that's just one response to what you mentioned about commodification and how these processes are going to look different in China rather than taking the example of Western Europe, America, or Japan. On the issue of class, I have to say that literature that I referenced, that 100-plus-year-old literature, has already addressed this question. And it says that in China, do you have a class of people who appropriate, who take the surplus and distribute the surplus? Well, of course you do, in the cadre class. And if you have a class of people, you aren't building a classless society. If there's a special group of people who haven't done anything to produce the social surplus, but their job is to appropriate it and then distribute it, you have in fact a class society. Thirdly, on common prosperity and how that relates to Xi Jinping, there's plenty, as I say, there's plenty of that language that China is still on the socialist road to building communism. And what can I say? I only know one Bible verse. By your fruit shall I know thee. So I'm not really interested in politicians or political leaders when their mouths are moving. I'm interested in policies and their outcomes. And if the policies and outcomes in China, however wonderful their ambition to centuries from now creating a communist paradise, right now we see the Gini coefficient exploding. Sure, they do like we do, or like universal basic income might do. We might put bandages on the worst excess of capitalism, but I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe that China. I love to be proven wrong. That all along this socialist stage, namely of state control over all of this stuff, required centuries and centuries, including billionaires, because you need your capital when you're fighting against the rest of the world. You need super flexible capital, so you need billionaires. That somehow that's going to one day morph into this egalitarian paradise. I'm only sorry that at 57 I won't be around likely to see it.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one more question in the chat box. Can I request Muskan to just quickly read it out?
No, sir. There's one question from Manushka Sharma. She says socialism with Chinese characteristics has been lauded by some for its adaptability and success in driving economic growth. However, it also has led to market distortions, inefficiencies, and prioritization of short-term economic gains over environmental sustainability. Can this theory or policy be considered a facade for China to hide its capitalist tendencies?
Yeah, my answer is quite similar to the last question. On one level, who doesn't want to believe your political leadership means what they say? I want to believe that Trump genuinely wants to make America great again as well. But I have to look at what's going on the ground. And me as an historian, I also don't want to take whatever the state tells me at its word. I don't want to take Trump as his word, as a former president, claiming to be that these policies are making America great again. And I don't want to take the Chinese Communist parties at their word. They may mean that, they may intend that. And that language, of course, discourse has a life of its own. It might box them in. It might force them to worry about the least among their population to a greater degree than Americans do. But I don't see it at the end of the day as a fundamentally different system that's replacing capitalism, that's negating capitalism, replacing it with something better, something more democratic, something more egalitarian. The Gini coefficient alone proves otherwise. The measure of inequality in China suggests otherwise. Yeah.
Okay, there is one more question in the chat box, which to me appears to be more or less similar to the question Anand had raised, but still, would you like to have a quick look and answer so that we save time in reading it out, or shall we read it out?
I'm taking a look right now.
Okay.
Well, gee, I think the last question is the one that I'm looking at, kind of like comparisons. I can only say briefly, especially my first book, I had Swadeshi movement. My first book studies the radical Chinese equivalent of a Buy American campaign. So like the Boston Tea Party and all of the efforts, Walmart, before it became what it is now, had a Buy American, a claim that it was first looking for American suppliers of products because Americans wanted to buy American products. I similarly, in that first book of my three, looked at the Swadeshi movement in India. So I always assume that the countries that I'm studying aren't located on Mars, but are located on Earth, and that countries in similar kinds of positions that China finds itself in, such as India, are going to have remarkable similar kinds of things. And as an historian focusing on the specific, it's my job to say, well, what's different about what's going on in China? In that first book, for instance, I said, well, China doesn't have tariff autonomy. It can't simply raise its tariff and protect its domestic market. And therefore, it has to have cultural manifestations for efforts to get people to see products as Chinese and foreign and get them to want to buy Chinese products rather than foreign products. Likewise, I can kind of look at what's going on in China during this period and compare it with what the Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union or the United States or other countries and see what is similar and what is different. And so to answer that person's questions, I always have implicit comparisons in my historical analysis because I don't like assuming that some country, just because of its long and glorious history, is going to be radically different from all of these other countries, especially this far, namely the second half of the 20th century forward, this far into the development of global capitalism. The idea that they're somehow developing on an island and that we can study them on their own without reference to what's going on in similar kinds of countries doesn't make any sense to me. So yes, my conclusions about China certainly apply to the Soviet Union. It's an even more open and shut case for the Soviet Union as well as Eastern Europe. And to go back to one of the earlier questions, I guess that means, I don't like to come to this conclusion that there is no alternative to the development of industrial capitalism. I'm saying, I hope there is, but we haven't seen it. And we haven't seen it perhaps not because that Mao was evil and really didn't mean well. We haven't seen it. If I have to pinpoint just one thing, I would say the other superpowers forced China to prioritize accumulation at all costs, including the cost of its wonderful aspirations to create an anti-capitalist socialist alternative.
Okay, we have one more question just came in the chat box, but Alka also was waiting for a final question, I believe.
It's okay. Let's take in. I mean, I'd rather that students got an opportunity to engage.
Muskan, can you please read quickly the last question, which is from Sugandha, I believe?
She writes that in the realm of China studies, we have witnessed a shift in methodology towards frameworks that emphasize cooperation and nuanced comparisons. Considering the focus of your framework on identifying similarities, would you characterize your approach as falling within the same category as mentioned above?
Yeah, oddly enough, that's the question I thought I was answering before, because I don't fully understand it. But what I was saying before is that if we have different tastes in what we like in history, I like directly and indirectly, as I've had sort of said with my analogy of America, making America great again, I like looking for comparative cases to flesh out what is actually different. So if I were to write a sequel or something, I would probably follow up on what I said earlier about work points. Should we expand our definition of capitalism to look at countries that looked a heck of a lot more like some form of feudalism in China during the Mao period, but then see how that global capitalism was sort of forcibly forcing it to operate in that way, where it had proto labor markets in the form of work points as a way of ensuring the state could squeeze as much as possible out of its population. So yeah, I think if I understand the question correctly, I think I'm agreeing by saying that I endorse the search for comparisons in order to flesh out what is historically unique about our cases.
Okay, thank you, Professor Carl Gerth. I think that now brings us to the point where we have to draw the curtain to this wonderful event. And we are almost now reaching the time where we have to conclude this session. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we are looking forward to you in person in the near future, as you said in the beginning. And once again, on behalf of the ICS and the participants in today's event, I thank you and wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. And if I don't see you there, perhaps I'll see you here in San Diego, floating among the clouds. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, maybe you could send us a picture of you then finally getting to surf those clouds.
I have actually done that. This is a tandem where you jump off a cliff and you're attached to somebody else. So you just you run, and off the cliff you go. It's quite spectacular.
It's quite spectacular indeed.
Highly recommended. I now insist on taking every visitor, so please come and visit on such a ride.
This has been absolutely fascinating, and I hope we can bring you in for another round when you have followed up on some of the questions that came out of your presentation. Maybe take it forward, particularly the last point where you mentioned the climate crisis. So I think that's really going to be an inflection point in terms of strategies for most countries, and how that really pans out in terms of state consumerism.
It should be a part. I mean, there was an environmental history conference recently here at San Diego that I didn't attend that perhaps I should have, because if you're doing environmental history and you're not looking at the other half of industrial capitalism, namely how it's pushing us to consume ever more, I'm not sure you have a very good or complete, we'll say, grasp of environmental history. So yes, I agree with you that one of the reasons why we're doomed is that we all live in a system that's determined to get us to want the iPhone 16 when the 15 won't do, or whatever it is. Where did that come from? How did that develop? How inescapable? That's why, going back to your question, I don't know if it's escapable, if we can escape it. I just know that no one's managed to yet. Instead, we see more and more buy-in rather than the opposite.
No, I wish Professor Manoranjan Mohanty had been here because his book, which came out a couple of years ago, which was on the success trap that the Communist Party had boxed itself into this kind of a model, and he in fact linked it with the exhaustion of the Industrial Revolution-led model, where this is a highly extractive, exploitative of natural resources and destructive of environment. So he has been writing and making this
Well,
almost a
yeah.
mission. Mm.
Well, I would certainly have a lot to talk to him. In my second book, As China Goes, So Goes the World, I also argued precisely the same thing, namely that China is somehow being asked to save the world magically in two contradictory ways. One, by fueling another round of economic global growth by consuming as much or more than Americans do. And two, somehow magically doing that without destroying the biosphere by releasing all of the associated carbon. And yet that's the direction it's heading, that, in the 70s. And the really awful thing, not wonderful, ironic thing is, of course, people in the 70s and 80s in China knew that this is what would happen, that once you start going down on the high consumption route for your economic development, you're going to end up with all this inequality, and you're going to end up with all of these pollution problems and all the other, especially specifically in the car markets. They knew what would happen if they used cars to fuel their 1990s round of economic development. Now they're the #1 car producer and consumer in the world as a consequence of that. So yes, heaven help us.
Thank you very much. Muskan, over to you to conclude, wrap it up.
Okay,
With
I'll
this,
go to sleep now.
Oh, yes, that's we really. I mean, that is another thing I must appreciate, your willingness to be woken up in the middle of the night. But right, thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, it was really my honor. I'm a big admirer of India, and it's a very big honor to speak at your institute. So thank you very much.
That is the most interesting point. Yes, Muskan.
Thank you.
with this, we conclude the session and express our gratitude to Professor Gerth and Dr. Adlakha for taking their time out of their busy schedules and sharing it with us. Today's video will be accessible on the ICS YouTube platform. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming Wednesday seminar titled The China Coast Guard, Interpreting Its Evolving Structure. Details about the event can be found on the ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletters for timely updates. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night, Carl.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.